Now let's get over to the University of Michigan. They're playing late on Saturday. It's going to be a late kickoff, I believe at 7:36. They're playing on national TV against New Mexico. This is a game that I fully expect Michigan to win comfortably and dominate from the get-go. My main questions heading into this game, especially for Michigan, because it was announced earlier this week that Bryce Underwood will be the starting quarterback for Michigan. For anyone that's surprised by this, I don't know where you've been looking at your news. I don't know where you've been hearing anything. When you pay a guy basically $13 million for 3 years, he's going to be your starting quarterback. And especially when he is the number one overall recruit in the country, one of the best quarterbacks coming out of high school in a really long time. If he didn't win the starting spot, there's concerns there, in my opinion. Now, Sharon Moore did say that he absolutely deserved it. There's questions there if he's just saying that. Now, I do think, and I have heard that Bryce Underwood has looked fantastic. But to anyone's surprise, he should look fantastic. He's been great throughout his career. I think he's going to be great at Michigan. But I also think that he's a freshman. And he's going up against a New Mexico team that has a new head coach. A head coach that hasn't really had a great defense, especially when he was the head coach at Idaho. Now, at Idaho, his teams were able to get a little bit of pressure. So I'm going to be interested to see what happens with Bryce Underwood if he is pressured a little bit. Now, with Michigan and their offensive line, do I expect New Mexico to get very much pressure on them? Probably not. I think this is also going to be a pretty basic game plan for Michigan and Bryce Underwood. I would think that Michigan would want to get Bryce Underwood in rhythm from the get-go. Maybe have a few runs, have a few easy passes. Maybe they want to take a deep shot with him. I don't know exactly what they want to do offensively, but at least the Michigan of past, they've been able to kind of get the quarterbacks going, get him going with confidence. And if they can do that with Bryce Underwood, I think this is exactly the game that you want to do it in, because this New Mexico team, secondary is basically all new, so they're going to be able to hopefully take shots there. Linebackers, the most intact from last year, so that's going to be one situation to really kind of keep an eye on for defense. But like I said, Coach Jason Eck, who is their new head coach, historically has not had great defenses. Now, he did end up bringing Kashawn James Newby from Idaho with him. He did have 10.5 sacks last year at defensive end. So if you want to look at one person to kind of keep an eye on for, especially on the defensive line, Kashawn is going to be one guy that I think Michigan fans should keep an eye on. But with that being said, I really don't expect this New Mexico defense to do very much against Michigan's offense. I think Michigan's going to be able to absolutely run the ball with Justice Haynes and Jordan Marshall. It seems like those two guys are the RB1, RB2. You have a couple other guys like Diane McCauley. Can he be wide receiver 1? You have Martin Klein and Brady Pershkorn at the tight end position. I probably completely botched his name. But I truly think that this offense, if they can get Bryce Underwood going, I think this offense is going to have zero issues on this defense. I just think this New Mexico team, they might be able to keep it close, but as long as Bryce Underwood doesn't turn over the ball, they should just continue to do what Michigan has done the last couple of years. Just continue to run the ball, continue to make great plays, and it's going to be something that's really going to factor in what's this wide receiver room going to look like, because there hasn't been a ton of talk out of Michigan for this wide receiver room. I knew they have a guy in like Andrew Marsh, who's a freshman that a lot of people were really excited about coming in. There just really hasn't been a ton of talk, though, like I'm saying, is it's really been kind of their tight ends. And I really think if you look offensively, especially the last couple of years and last year, now I know quarterback last year was an issue, but offensively, I really think the one area that Michigan needs to have guys step up is the wide receiver room. And can they step up with a player like Bryce Underwood? Because I do think quarterback last year really was a detriment to Michigan and what they wanted to do. I do think that really hurt, but I also think the wide receiver room did not help Michigan whatsoever last year. And they did go in and get a couple of guys You have Dynamic McCulley, like I mentioned. He was great at his past school. There was a ton of hype about him. He was productive. Could he be the wide receiver number one? It's just real question marks with this team. But I do think that Michigan's going to still be pretty run heavy. But I think you're going to see maybe a little bit more balance of run versus pass and all that kind of stuff. So we can see maybe a little bit of a better performance from quarterback and wide receivers. I think that's going to help Michigan and their fans and their confidence going into this season. I still fully expect that Bryce Underwood will make freshman mistakes. You don't see a ton of quarterbacks coming in their freshman year that's an instant starter that don't make those mistakes. You might see one or two throws in this game that you're really questioning, like, what is he doing? But overall, I don't really think this necessarily matters because when you have a defense as good as Michigan is, I don't really think one or two turnovers, if it does happen, will really hurt this team, especially when you have an offense and offensive line like Michigan and when you're going up against a defense like New Mexico State and a head coach that has historically not had a great defense. But also speaking of historically, he's been a great offensive head coach before he came to New Mexico. At Idaho, I believe it was like a top 25 offense at one point. Now, last year, if you're looking at New Mexico, they actually allowed the fewest sacks in the country last year. Now, they do only have Richard Pierce returning for the offensive line, so the rest of it's going to be filled out with transfers. But that's one strength that New Mexico had last year was their offensive line was able to not really allow much pressure on the quarterback. Now, they obviously will have a new quarterback. It's going to be a quarterback that Josh Eck is actually very familiar with, and it's quarterback transfer Jack Lane, which was actually announced, I believe, like a week ago, that he will be the starting quarterback for New Mexico. He was obviously the starting quarterback for Idaho last year. Very familiar with him. He was pretty good at Idaho. Obviously, Jason Eck is very familiar with him as well. He was his quarterback. When you have a coach that leaves, really likes his quarterback, they typically take their quarterback with him, kind of start him, and I think that's exactly what Coach Eck is doing. And I think he's going to be able to bring a little bit of comfortability with this offense in New Mexico. I think it's going to be able to translate now when you're going up against a defense like Michigan that is really good in the secondary. They have a couple of guys returning in the secondary. You also have a defensive line that is very good at getting to the pass rusher. And then you also have linebackers that have experience there. Like you have guys on this Michigan defense that just causes issues every single down. And that's the biggest issue that a lot of these teams face is when Michigan can get pressure over and over and over and you can't run the ball, when it gets to that third and long and they're bringing pressure, that's when teams make mistakes. And that's why Michigan has been so good defensively. They've been able to get to the quarterback. And I think they'll continue to do that there, especially with a pretty new offensive line. But New Mexico does have some other interesting pieces. One of them is actually a running back. They have running back transfer Scott Humphrey from Montana State. He ran for almost 1,100 yards, 13 touchdowns last year. Now, again, I've talked a lot about how good Michigan defensively is, especially stopping the run with a new offense line. Do I think a great running back will really make that much of a difference? It could. We've seen it in the past make much of a difference, but those are running backs that should have been in the Heisman ceremony or some of the best running backs in the entire country. But obviously, maybe Scott Trey is going to be that guy. But he's a guy that I think a lot of fans are pretty excited about in New Mexico. But I think he might have a little bit of a rough day in this game against Michigan. The last thing I really want to talk about, especially when it comes to New Mexico, is the wide receiver core. It's basically starting over. Kind of a common theme it really seems to be for a lot of these quote-unquote smaller teams. They really have to start over, especially with new head coaches, and it's going to be starting with a couple of guys that even though they're starting over, they have Keegan Johnson and Isaiah Blair are two guys to keep an eye on the outside. I think there are going to be guys that are going to be contributors for this New Mexico team. Now, again, secondary-wise, I think Michigan should be able to do a good enough job on them to not really be too concerned about them. But I think if you're going to kind of keep an eye on for a couple of guys, I think you really have to think of Keegan Johnson, Isaiah Blair from the wide receiver room. You have Scott Trey Humphrey from the running back room. And then you obviously have their new starting quarterback in Jack Lane to see exactly what he can do from translating from Idaho to New Mexico. So this is just going to be a game, like I said earlier, I don't really think there's going to be a ton to really kind of keep an eye on for. I think this is going to be a game that Michigan really isn't going to feel too much pressure. And I think it's going to be a great time to spotlight Bryce Underwood, which I think is exactly why they're doing the game when they're doing it. I think they want to spotlight him. I think there's going to be a lot of conversation about him. I think there's going to be basically all day just leading up to the Bryce Underwood show. And rightfully so. That's the reason why he's got so much attention in the offseason. That's the reason why he's had a ton of press conferences or interviews. He talked about in one of those interviews, you haven't seen a freshman like me. I think that's going to bring a lot of attention to him. I think that's also going to make him need to perform better right away. Now, I do think fans are going to give him time to perform, but he's also a freshman, so he's going to learn some things. He's going to go through some growing pains for the most part, but this is a game that you ease him into to help him prepare for Oklahoma, because this game at home against New Mexico should not be a game that you should be concerned about whatsoever. Sharon Moore should be more focused on Oklahoma at this point. I just think New Mexico just doesn't have enough to get an upset. I think Michigan's just way too talented. I think Michigan's just returning way too much. And I think with Bryce Underwood under the helm, I think this Michigan team will start 1-0, and I don't think anyone is extremely surprised about that at all if they're listening to this. So, yeah, that's really Michigan, New Mexico.